In today's episode of the Hunter Valley PaleoZoo, we'll take full advantage of how dark buildings can get in Jurassic World Evolution 3 to build a realistic nocturnal house, with habitats for Psittacosaurus, Troodon, and even a prop-built Microraptor. My name is Supersaurus, and as always, I hope you're having a wonderful day and welcome back to the channel. This build has been on my to-do list since day one of release, and seeing it fully realised with these animals in the dark where they would thrive best in captivity is so surreal. So with the intro out the way, let's get right into the speed build. Now what we're seeing here is that I've gone ahead before I started recording and just planned out the entire building using grid pieces. At the start of this build, I did plan to have it be just like a general grid building. You'll see that changes later on. But right now you can see here, I'm going for a brick aesthetic. There might be an image on screen kind of showing the general vibe of the building I was going for on the outside, but that completely changes. And what you can see here is I'm using some of the darker panel pieces to kind of just create a darker interior wall rather than showing the brick. And you'll also see here that the interior is going to be based heavily off of Taronga Zoo's nocturnal house, which you'll see an image of on screen now. You can see here I'm just playing around with the size of the hallways. While I don't do backstage, you'll see that I kind of have implied backstage areas, so that when you're looking at the building from the outside, it looks like there reasonably could be backstage in here. But I didn't want to build it. This build ended up being 25,000 pieces, so even bigger than the tropical house. So yeah, just backstage wasn't really on the cards for realism in this build. So here I'm going all over and adding in those walls here using the felt for the interior walls. And you will see a cut shortly. I forgot to record part of this, and I also forgot to record the end. Very sorry, but it's all very much samey towards the end. All you really see me miss out of in this first cut is, well, which happened just here, is I started placing the flooring and you miss me make the fence for the Psittacosaurus, but I make a very similar fence for the Troodon, so nothing to worry about there. What you can see as well here with the fencing and the little area there, what we've used, I've just made a separate viewing area surrounded by some rocks based off the bilby habitat at the Taronga Zoo nocturnal house, which you'll see on screen now. And kind of going again with that Australian vibe, China in the Cretaceous period did have some like outbacky style deserts according to my research. So I thought that'd be a great for the Psittacosaurus, kind of pay homage to the Australian setting of this zoo, with that outbacky style, as well as being a paleo accurate to where these guys lived in the wild. So I've used one of these sand terrain pieces here that is recolorable and just changed it to a nice earthy red sand. And you see here I'm just kind of rotating some around to remove the repeating textures a little bit, but it really doesn't look too bad, especially once we add in all the foliage, which we're starting to do here. Starting with some of the desert bloodwood trees, just kind of shrunken down so they fit inside. There's a lot of like most likely fake dead trees or even some real ones they found. And see, I'm just checking the terrain maneuverability of these animals, making sure to not kind of cover up too much of their traversable area. Starting to add in a few cactuses, using some of the prickly pears, which are a very common invasive species in Australia. So, while we wouldn't want these getting in the wild, they grow especially formless varieties, and they'd be cheap and easy to put in here and really add to that desert aesthetic. See here, also adding in a bunch of the dry Russian prickly bushes, bristle bushes, which is the only that kind of dried plant. We also add in some of the bare chrysolite bushes later, but really going heavy on these to kind of add that deserty outback grass. You can see here looking at the build at nighttime, because obviously it's a nocturnal house. It's going to be really dark in here to kind of create that alternate daylight cycle. But you can see for viewer guest ease, we've added in these, I've added in the LED strips underneath the fence, which kind of acts as like a light guide so that guests know where the walls are, they know where the fence is, and kind of stop them from running into any walls while their eyes are getting adjusted to the dark. See, I'm adding in a bunch of rock kind of like pebble structures. Those will have what's collision turned off, because otherwise they won't be able to move anywhere. And you can see here I'm just testing like, what can I turn the collision off that has a bigger radius but like is covered by one of the other objects, just to make sure that there's as much traversable space as possible. So now I'm going on to add the back walls, again just using those panel pieces that we used for the guest hallways, just kind of continuing that around for continuity. This is where I started to kind of realizing that I might not really want to do it backstage, because it's just, it's very tedious stuff and it's not going to be visible. So yeah, you can see here I'm now playing around with the roof. I originally go for this navy blue kind of look, we ended up just changing it to black. It really doesn't make that much of a difference, I just thought the black looks slightly nicer later. Here just checking the height and also playing around with adding some more neon signs, but you'll see that it kind of like, they lose their color if you look at them from too far away, so we end up scrapping that. But what I don't end up scrapping is using these LED tubes here to create like stars, like a star effect on the ceiling. And I think this turned out really good, both from a visual aesthetic of like kind of creating that nighttime atmosphere, but also the way the glow works, it kind of makes it more easy to view the animals as well in game, because otherwise it's like completely pitch black. So these have a functionality point in game as well as making it, look pretty and cool. So you see I've just made like one group and then like alternate rotation on, kind of like mixing them in the groups and all of that kind of stuff to create this like random constellation effect. And it looks really cool. So you can see here I've just gone ahead and added in a roof over the top. And now I'm adding in some of those bare crescent bushes, which I mentioned before, a few lower of the desert bloodwoods. And here I play around with adding some rocks. And we're going to use the Jurassic World carved sign, just making sure we can't see the Jurassic World logo, to create like this back wall, like this kind of like faux rock background to the bottom of the wall, just to add a bit of texture, a bit of variation. And also at this point is where I completely disregard the idea of doing backstage, because it kind of like pokes through and I'm like, you know what, I would prefer to have this here and have it look cool than like try and fiddle around for backstage. So that's the design decision I ended up making here, and I'm really happy I did. Like I said, it ended up being 25,000 pieces, so God knows how many it would have been if I did a full realistic backstage. So just kind of taking them all around here. You see I add in a hidden door. They're just by sinking it in, so just the edge of the door and the handle is visible. And then kind of going around, sometimes rotating it to kind of not make it be uniform and remove the illusion of repeating textures. Here I play around with these, those like the rocks we used at the temple for the tropical house, but they weren't really the vibe here. Instead I use these rock planters and kind of like rotate them. You see I kind of play around with white for a second there. That comes into play for the Troodon habitat. But just kind of creating these into like a deserty outback color. I end up using them for the, when we change the aesthetic of the exterior to kind of create these like faux rock walls on the side. So those turned out to be a really important discovery for this build. And you can see here I'm playing around with just the lights, checking the roof, all of that kind of stuff, and some logs. So you can already see what I'm talking about here with those glowing effect there. But we do actually add in a few big lights because even though this is a nocturnal house, it's important that these animals do experience a daytime for their natural behaviors. So what would happen is during the nighttime when the guests aren't here, they would have it would be daytime inside the nocturnal house. So that's why I've kind of put the lights on the ceiling so I can see what I'm doing. And so I'm kind of creating this little barrier around the enclosure, and then we'll add in a bunch of like large scale lighting that in the game's version of this, of like lights only appearing at nighttime, is perfect for this. That automatic schedule really works well. But yeah, you see here I've kind of created this like barrier, taking that around using concrete. And then I'll go ahead and mark out just the guest area here as well for a little bit extra realism, just a little bit detail. And then, yeah, you can see over here, going around, and we use these lights over here and just kind of creating these barriers of lights to make sure that when it's nighttime and that these guys need to experience their daytime, it's fully bright and it looks like it, to mimic those natural behaviors. You can see I've kind of not perfectly aligned it, so I'm fiddling around with these. I first try to use the barrier that I created, end up just aligning it with the lights later, but meddling around trying to get it right. It doesn't really work. I think it's worked here, and I'm like, oh no, it's still not correct. So we end up getting it working, but yeah, just like that, lining that up with the back wall, because I thought the lights were slightly more important than having the encasement kind of like trim of concrete being lined up perfectly. So we just kind of do that, and then we kind of create this grid, just making sure this entire habitat at nighttime is fully lit up. And that also helps with helping you guys see what's going on here, because I do admit it is a bit dark. All by design, of course. So yeah, you can see here I'm just kind of testing it, making sure it looks good at nighttime. Daytime. Nighttime in the nocturnal house, daytime in the outside. And then here we go around and work on the path. I end up moving that neon sign over to here because with the glitch it's kind of like only visible when you're in range. And then here I start working on these walls. So they may have been shown off in the image of the Taronga Nocturnal House interior I showed earlier, but if they're not, you'll see an image on screen now. Kind of showing like the pattern I'm going for here. And these purple lights will end up being on a gradient that goes from like this purple here, maybe a bit of a darker purple later, all the way to like a bright blue at the end. and that like looks really cool. But we don't do that for a little bit. Right here, I'm just kind of creating this kind of like squiggly line pattern here, which I end up putting all the way across. Just copying that design from the Taronga's Nocturnal house, and I think it looks really pretty. So yeah, see adding on that bottom one as well. And then we use some girders over here just to kind of create a little ledge to kind of like, you know, these lights would get pretty hot being on, you know, 12 hours a day essentially. So just to stop people from accidentally touching them and we're getting burnt that way, just those little girders as protection. See over here, I was playing around with seeing to get the people benches working, but they didn't, I don't know why. There is a pathway going here from an entrance, but it didn't want to work, so I just ended up forgetting about that. And here I play around with adding in some like faux trees as like arches, and I ended up deciding to put these on the outside. And this is where the idea to change the whole exterior really starts to form, and I end up basing it off of Sydney Zoo's Nocturnal and Reptile House, which is like this like hill that the interior is hollowed out and has all their reptiles and nocturnal creatures in there. I end up recreating that. You'll see an image of that on screen now. And so we end up using, like I mentioned earlier, with those fake rocks I made out of the planters, kind of creating these like fake rock walls. And then yeah, here using the grass terrain pieces to kind of create a hill, which is a lot easier than trying to do this using actual terrain. So thankfully those pieces exist. And we just kind of like put them on a 15-degree rotation and then kind of do them up 3 times. And I think that looked really cool. So you can see here I'm messing around with these rocks, rotating them to kind of, you know, fit the curve. And I think it turns out really cool. If you've been paying attention to my community post, you would have seen the finished exterior. The finalizing of adding all the plants and the rocks is the other bit I forgot to record, so nothing major. You see it in the cinematics, and you will also see me start to add in some grass and stuff. Maybe here. I know I do a version with thyme bushes, which I don't end up liking, but so yeah, you can see over here just adding in all of the rocks around the edge of the hill to kind of act as a retaining wall. Well, kind of, that's exactly what they're doing. Obviously not in-game, but in real life they would be. And see using different scaled ones, and yeah. Here I play around with my first iteration of adding foliage to this to kind of like buff it out, you know, it's like not really it wouldn't be mowed or anything like that, that'd just be completely unreasonable. And also it acts as creating habitat for insects and all kinds of stuff, so it has an ecological purpose as well, you know. Even though this is a dinosaur zoo, you know, ecology and, you know, trying to protect real life species as well would be a part of their marketing and just like principles as well. So making sure there's habitat for all like the insects and stuff that would be displaced when this is getting built is important. And having like these natural buildings helps with that. So you can see over here now I'm going for just like covering up the rest of the roof, making sure that it is tall enough that, you know, the lights don't stick out, that we can put in, when I sunk in trees and bushes and stuff, they're not clipping through the roof as well is important, so just getting that extra bit of height. What you can see I'm doing over here is just cleaning up the stars in the Psittacosaurus habitat, making sure they're not poking through the daytime lights, because that's really obvious at nighttime, as well as like keeping them in the enclosure and not on the path. So here I'm just like moving around, checking that. We turn it to nighttime. I'm just seeing how it looks from a distance, making sure there's no like light glitches, which end up happening, but there was no way to avoid it, and it looks fine at nighttime. Daytime, sorry. So what you can see I'm doing over here now is like, just to add a bit more interest on the floor, I create this kind of like floor pattern here, using like the big dots, circle decals, and then like some smaller ones in between. And I think it turns out really cool. See how the little like alternating path going over into that viewing area, and then it kind of continues around. What you can see I'm starting to do here is work on that gradient I mentioned earlier. So you can see over here, every time I pause, I've got a browser open, and I've gone, I can't remember the name of the website, I might link it down below if you guys are interested in doing this kind of technique in your own builds. And I've basically just gone, this kind of purple and this is the blue I want, and then create 15 colors in between. And we end up going every 3 we change it, and it creates this really subtle gradient that looks really cool from a distance. Here I'm just kind of testing the perfect height of the roof so that I can still click on them, because otherwise I just click on the roof and it's really hard to duplicate them around. And yeah, that's what you can see I'm doing over here, kind of changing out all these different colors, these slight difference in hex codes. It's really not too visible here, but once you see like the whole thing, you'll really see the difference in color as it goes across. So here, just kind of duplicating all of that. We end up doing that, and then changing that purple over there. So duplicate over here, and then that's the blue I was hoping I'd reach at that point. We end up don't, but we get there on the other wall. See over here, just like every 3, changing that color. And then over here, I'm kind of trying to fiddle around with making it end at the right spot. It was pretty dark though, so I end up overestimating, long-shotting it by a lot. You can see over here, I'm going to like that when I kind of forget there's a little indent there, but we fix that later. So you can see over here, we're just going through every 3 and changing that color, and you can already start to see the gradient going over here, how it like ends up blue at the end and still purple at the start. So after I've changed all those colors, I realized my mistake and I copy it down to the bottom, and it ends up looking really cool. Over here, just doing a little bit of work on the flooring. I ended up cutting out a lot of the work on this floor because it's extremely repetitive, so you don't have to see me put circle decals across the entire building. But yeah, so over here, just continuing that pattern, using the squiggly lines, kind of lining them up to be at the right height so it's uniform throughout, and then just deleting that bit of wall there for a second so I can collect all of them and duplicate them across. Here, and then take them again and rotate it, that, and just kind of to hide the fact that they don't line up perfectly, placing one of those trees. Now over here we are moving on to the Troodon habitat. Quite a large shift in biome for this habitat. Whilst we had that outback look for the Psittacosaurus, we're going for like a more tundral, boreal forest look. So we end up using, before I'll get into the habitat in a second, but right here I am working on the fence. I do end up using this design, but I kind of made a mistake with the rotation of it, so it didn't line up properly and we have to make it again. You see over here I'm using the glass pieces. We have those LEDs underneath some girders for some like guide lighting, and then I'm using some mesh pieces up the top here to create ventilation. Essentially, especially with the glass going all the way up, just because they are a carnivore and for safety, it kind of becomes a giant terrarium, and you've got to make sure you have healthy ventilation so the air doesn't become stagnant for the animals' safety. So that's what having those mesh up the top there does. See here I'm making all of the metal black, just for uniform, and then I start going around and deleting the pieces of the guideline that I have there, just making sure it's on pause because I don't want the Troodons to get out and then have to do all of that again. You might see I do change the Troodons though. I end up like releasing these ones to the wild and getting new ones just because I didn't like the skin. The skin I had was a very dark one, like a tiger, but they didn't show up at all in this enclosure, especially for the reduced visibility for the glass. So we ended up going for a different design that you saw in the cinematics at the beginning. See over here, now I'm starting to realize that the glass isn't lining up because it's on an angle, and so we end up, just taking it all, and then I'm like, what the hell is going on here? So we take them up to the top where I can see better, and just make sure it's all perfectly lined up. While I'm remaking this fence, basically I kind of mentioned we're going for like a tiger boreal look, so we had some fake snow, some like the calamite plants, and a bunch of forested trees, and it ends up looking really cool. Here I'm just making sure the height is exactly the same as it was on the Psittacosaurus habitat. And then we just kind of fix this up, adding in our mesh like that. Fixing the fence. And then we are ready to go ahead and enclose this habitat. So, like I mentioned, the Psittacosaurus habitat was based off Zoo's Bilby habitat. And this one is also based off of one of the Zoo habitats. The biome's different, but it is kind of largely based off the yellow belly glider habitat in their nocturnal house, which you'll quickly see an image of on screen, and the Microraptor is also heavily inspired off that habitat, especially with the fencing and all of that kind of stuff. Zoo just has like the best nocturnal house of any Australian zoo, of any zoo really that I've seen. So no choice but to go off of that zoo. So you see over here, I'm just making sure, going bit by bit and aligning. Well, not aligning, but kind of just like building it out. And so I end up deciding that I want the wall to start here rather than where it was before. And then it's time to add in all of our stars. So I'm using just the trim of the mesh that was poking out above, and that just acts as a guide so I keep it within the enclosure. And then what we do is we start adding in some sticks and all kinds of like dead trees to create this nice densely forested look. and just kind of like making sure they're on random rotation. I end up making it nighttime so I can see a bit better, so you guys can see a bit better watching this speed build. And just kind of like using a few different types there. Checking the collision, making sure that, you know, they're going to be able to move around. And yeah, we end up going for some of those rocks, but you turning them white and sinking them down to kind of create this like fake snow look. Obviously this wouldn't be actual snow because it would be extremely hard to temperature regulate this, especially with the ventilation. But, you know, just fake snow kind of gets that vibe across. This would be cooled, like there would be some like air conditioning and to kind of keep this enclosure a bit colder than the Psittacosaurus one, but it wouldn't be like a huge amount smaller. It's not like these guys lived in Antarctic temperatures or anything like that. So yeah, adding all of this like fake snow, different, you know, like sizes, like random rotation, kind of sunken into the ground, bits showing out, you know, it's been kicked around by the Troodons and stuff like that. It's not uniform whatsoever. And then I start by adding some lights. So yeah, you can see there we kind of like skip to the end of the lights. I don't know if, I think I do remove some of these. I don't know if I cut it out, but basically I added way too many lights, and you can start to see there on that tree that it's glitching out. Yeah, like on that window there, it's just extremely glitchy because it's just too much light. So we just remove a few of them like and evenly space them out. So it's a bit darker in here than I would have liked in some areas, but you know, the entire enclosure isn't glitching out in a, you know, square, blocky, black mess. So, you know, it's whatever you trade off, in my opinion. And it looks absolutely fine when it's like daytime and you're viewing it as a guest would in public, so that's not really an issue. And then over here, I'm using some of those temple rocks just as their base color. I say temple rocks because they kind of give like jungly vibes, but they're like not called that in game. As just kind of like rock piles and like duplicating them around and stuff. And then I used some of the temperate rocks as a few extra boulders and stuff like that to kind of add a bit more variety. Looks really cool. For foliage, you can see here we've got a bunch of bracken ferns, tree ferns, all that cool stuff here. And then I'm using some of the like the flat cover ivy as like clovers or like just general weeds and stuff that are growing through here to kind of create that foresty look. And I think that was a really effective thing here, adding in a kind of like a fallen tree over these logs because the collision was already like they couldn't go through there just with the basic size. So I was like, you know what, may as well like, you know, expand upon that and like put on a log there. So yeah, adding see here, I'm kind of like to make it a bit more densely forested, I'm using the calamites brush. I get like a few in the back corner that like are under the height limit, but none of the others I could get to grow. So it's kind of like, I don't want to use too many, but I end up using one that skips through the roof because you can suspend your disbelief for, I feel like, kind of thins out just at the point where it's a little bit invisible. Here you can see we're adding a few benches along the back here and then continuing on with carrying out the floor. And big cut there, just because like the camera was like warping and all over stuff, you know, working indoors can be like that. But over here, I'm just using some of those rocks again because they're like poking through the wall and just making that a feature, you know, kind of like continuing that rock motif into the interior a little bit. Here I just place a wall on the side, a lamp on the wall to kind of help me see what I'm doing. And then you're kind of like fixing up the top here, making it look a bit more even, a little bit more realistic, as if this was an actual hill. See over here, I'm just taking some of the dots and, you know, matching that, continuing that pattern, making sure it's all complete. And then I take the wall from the Psittacosaurus habitat and just copy that over for the Troodons to continue that motif. And it works even better in this enclosure, in my opinion, because the colors match up. Over here in this enclosure is going to be the Microraptor. You don't see me make the Microraptor. I made this Microraptor like way back between the second and third episode. And I was just waiting for the Nocturnal house to use it. But it is on the workshop. Some of you may have already seen it. On the workshop, I kind of put it out. There's a little sneaky peek preview of this episode. You can see over here, I'm adding a bunch of logs connecting these trees just for extra perches, you know, climbing opportunities for the Microraptors to kind of, you know, add some structural enrichment to the enclosure. And then we end up using some of these bracket pieces or brace pieces, I can't remember the name of them, that were used in the Osteoraptors like feeding cages, and just kind of using these to secure the logs to the trees, or at least that's the like in-universe explanation for what they're doing there. So you see like matching, you know, connecting up those logs to each other, adding a bit more structural support rather than just kind of like existing next to the tree. We add a few stars, and then yeah, here are the Microraptors that I made. Just kind of using a bunch of the circle decals for feathers, and I could probably make a better one, but I wasn't really feeling bothered. If you do have a Microraptor you've made, let me know and I'll see, and if I like it, I'll replace mine with it. But I couldn't really find any on the workshop at the moment. So you see over here, just checking a few things, making sure that the lights down the bottom of the enclosure here line up, and then filling out the floor over here at the exterior of the, well, not exterior, but the exit of the nocturnal house. See here, just adding a little bit of foliage, but it was kind of peeking out, so it wasn't really working. And then making sure to add doors for our Troodon habitat and the Microraptor enclosure. Again, just kind of like adding that implied backstage, where, you know, there is the space for it, but didn't really feel bothered to make it, and that's totally okay. See here, adding a access from the guest area for the backstage, and then working on adding those extra dots through the path, and, you know, adding that little kind of like floor guide really well. Throughout here, these would also be like, have a little bit of a reflective property, again, just to make sure that people don't, you know, can see where they're going. Sometimes, you know, different people take different amount of times to expose to light, to dark rooms, so you just wanted to, you know, for safety, you don't want anyone walking into the wall or anything like that. Over here, I'm just finishing up on the neon, you know, wall pattern across the back wall. Adding on, you know, you see over here, I'm just again going on that gradient, continuing it around to a more lighter blue. Making sure to add the girders for safety there, as well as just, you know, making sure it's not too light. So yeah, we do that. In real life, these would probably emit more light than they do in game, so adding that girder there is just kind of makes it feel a bit more realistic to the light level you see. And I just copy and pasted those dots across from the other ones, no point in redoing it. And then just cleaning up those areas where they overlapped, because the wall wasn't, you know, the perfect size for it. And again, just adding some walls over there. Not walls, dots, and then deleting them where they poked out the side. Adding in the squiggly lines and making sure that pattern is all looking nice. And then over here, I start working on this final little back wall over here. And I add a little Dimorphodon sign there and a raptor one. And you can see over here, it was kind of like that little wall there, like roof, was a slightly indented, so it didn't kind of line up perfectly, so I fixed that. And the purpose for that little extra room, I guess you could say there, is just to stop the light from directly from outside hitting the enclosure, just kind of acting as a light barricade and helping it be darker at the enclosures. Without that, it would, you know, probably be too light in areas, and it'll kind of like mess with the daylight cycle, the reverse daylight cycle that we're going for in here. And then, yeah, adding in those extra signs. Now, at this point, we are starting to get to the end of the speed build. I don't know if I do much else actually in the interior that you guys see. So here, adding in some more rocks, kind of adding in, there's a little bit of color variation in there, covering in up all the gaps. And you can see here, just adding, like we did at the entrance, adding some on this wall over here inside. And, you know, using a bit of copy and paste, just to make it go faster, because there's no point in placing every individual rock when, if you duplicate a big enough group, one, it makes it go faster, and you can't really tell, especially if you use a bit of rotation, add a few extras in there, and, you know, it just makes it, make the process a lot faster. These rocks here are the reason why the piece count is so intensive. I think they account for like half the build, especially when, you know, I cover the entirety of both ends of this building in the rocks, so that's why it gets, you know, really piece count intensive. But it didn't take us nearly as long as the tropical house, because it's not, you know, pieces aren't coming from different bits. So you see over here, just adding in that little retaining wall at the bottom, and then, yeah, just like collecting all of those rocks, and then we just copy and paste it onto the other side. Again, no need to bother redoing what I've already done. So you can see over here, I'm just taking a big group of these rocks, and I end up just like duplicating this all around, which ends up creating this like really cool kind of like uniform rock wall, and, you know, like sturdy retaining wall, and, you know, really create the idea of this like large hill that's been, you know, carved out, and, you know, we have this like cool and nocturnal house inside there. It ends up being really effective, looks a lot like the source material I was going for, and, you know, I think it's one of the coolest parts of, you know, this park, you know, especially when you have the sight lines and the Montana Trail, and you can kind of like see this big hill. It looks really cool, and you guys will actually get to see that very soon. As you can see here, I'll get into that in just a second, but over here you can see I'm starting to add in some of the grass and, you know, all of that on the edge of the hill. I'm just going to duplicate that and then start adding in a bunch of trees and stuff. I do it off camera. I end up adding in a little area for like guest seating and some extra saplings on the top of the hill. But that's pretty much this whole video, so I hope you've liked it. Make sure to like and subscribe, stick around for the cinematics, but first, next episode is episode 10, and that marks the halfway point of the series. So instead of being a speed build, it's actually going to be a tour. I'll go through, talk about all the different parts of the build. If you have anything specific you want me to answer about this build, or like inquiries as to how I did something, make sure to leave a comment and I'll get around to it in the tour. And that will also mean that this park will be on the workshop next week, so look around for that. I can't wait for you guys to be able to get your hands on this park, you know, dissect it all, take it all apart and see how I've done everything. But until then, enjoy the video, enjoy the cinematics. Bye-bye.